was a very insecure person to her dying day.
That's his wife.
Eva Feuermann, yeah.
Yes.
And she never worked, and that was a maybe choice, and just by virtue of her background, sort of an assumption made about how she would live her life. But she sometimes, it made me a little bit sad sometimes, because I think she thought maybe she wasn't good enough in anything to do it professionally or well, and her class and her generation wasn't expected that women would work. But Feuermann, there are a number of letters, he demanded her to become her own person. He was like, you can't just be. That was one of the letters I think she was very concerned about being
wonderful.
published before she died.
Oh, interesting.
He was very like, who are you, Eva? And what are you going to be? You can't just be the wife. And it was interesting because he came from a family of people who worked, women and men, because they were poor.
Oh, I see.
My grandmother had no relationship to that. And I don't know that anybody had demanded that she think about those things before. And he for sure challenged her that way, and I don't think it was entirely pleasant. And I think his confidence, from the letters I've read, was very strong. I mean, rightfully so, and he had his strong ideas about things.
Did your grandmother ever speak about how she felt about that?
He was a very difficult man to be married to, I think, for her.
I see.
I'm not convinced their marriage would have lasted. I think she might have said the same thing, had he lived. I think it's interesting, the class difference, despite the fact that he had been embraced by this very wealthy family, but their roots were so incredibly different, and neither one of them changed very much at that very short period of time, so who's to say what might have happened. But my grandmother, she came from a certain class and certain way of life, and she became very American in a lot of ways, which...
I've been listening to you talk about her now for some time now, and I guess you love her as your grandmother, but it seems that you have a lot of respect for her as a person.
Oh, yeah, my Oma was incredible. I mean, she spent a lot of time with my grandmother and my brother and I growing up. She lived in Princeton for most of her childhood, and she was in the city. We would be all the time, and we would be dropped.
So she was wealthy, she was aristocratic, but she's...
Well, aristocratic, it's complicated. It's interesting. I was reading about
just knowing you, I mean, you have your own personal set of values, but you're able to admire her still, so she must have also had some depth as a human being. And
fully.
Yeah.
I mean, she was an incredible woman, and she was so kind. She was also a class act. I mean, she really was. And for whatever reason, she didn't die with the wealth. She didn't die in poverty by any stretch of the imagination, but she no longer had the wealth that she was born into. And I don't think she ever struggled financially, but for sure it wasn't like goo-gops of money left anymore. And, but...
You feel Feuermann chose well. Not just because of her beauty, but because of her person.
Yeah, I mean, I think that marriage was slightly manipulated. I don't think that happened by itself,
What do you mean?
He was tethered to the Reifenberg family for whatever reasons. I mean, there were a lot of them. One being, I think, my grandmother's mother, Emma, was conniving and controlling and wanted Feuermann. I think she was in love with Feuermann, and but I also like drama and stuff, so like I like to imagine these things. But when you read the letters, I do think she was kind of in love with him and like a little bit like obsessed. And her husband died. Paul Reifenberg died before my grandmother was married, I believe, to Feuermann. And so she was a widow, like flailing, and all this money, but nothing to do, and no husband. And I think that relationship, he was tethered, they became his adopted family in a lot of ways, the Reifenbergs.
But am I putting words in your mouth when I think what you're saying is that your great-grandmother was in love with Feuermann and she manipulated a marriage with her daughter?
I think so, yes. Very frankly, yes, I did think so.
Yeah.
I mean, my grandmother must have had free will, and so did Feuermann. I mean, he knew lots of ladies, from what I understand. I'm not sure. I don't think that was a marriage because they fell in love. I know that. It wasn't like they fell in love and they had to be together. No. I think they loved each other for sure.
I see.
But I think it was another era, and I don't know if people got married at that time anyway because they fell in love. At least not that class of people, but
So there was something arranged about this?
I think Emma Reifenberg completely
I mean, there is a
manipulated
kind of
that.
Jewish tradition of arranged marriage. I mean,
Yeah, but that's
among
not
the
what that was.
That's a more orthodox kind of.
That wasn't that.
Wasn't that?
No.
I see.
I think Emma Reifenberg wanted Feuermann in the family, needed to keep him there. That was the last, my grandmother was the last of
Oh.
7 children.
I see.
Lily had married Lucas, whatever, Herr Lucas or whatever
So
his name
Lily
is.
was her other daughter.
Older daughter, and
Yeah.
he had a stronger relationship with her. Yeah, I think it was a complicated relationship, and I think, I mean, I also want to be respectful of my grandmother, not to reveal too much, because we spent many days, she told me so many things about their relationship that are quite intimate and quite private, that I think should stay private,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah, no, you have to.
But for sure there wasn't a marriage based in falling in love. Like, my mother and father fell in love. That was a love story.
I see.
My grandmother, Eva, and Emanuel Feuermann, I don't think they fell in love. I think they loved each other, and it was rooted in a history they shared and managed by a very controlling mother.
Wow.
You know?
Wow.
Yeah.
And it was this controlling mother that arranged for the surgery that led to this terrible death.
Yeah, it was. Emma,
Wow.
it was. And Sophie, his sister, Sophie Feuermann, always assumed it was my grandmother, Feuermann's wife, who was responsible for that. And when I heard that, I was horrified and talked to my grandmother about it. And Eva, my grandmother, explained that in fact she was sick in bed and it was her mother who did that.
Wow.
So Emma was really, she got up in there.
Yeah.
I mean, they're great letters. I mean, and one thing that Kronberg Academy, the Feuermann Grand Prix people, were good for was they have sort of a reception every year, that every 4 years when they have this Grand Prix for Feuermann's name, and they have these letters hugely printed in these big billboard type things as a display. And I think some of them are translated into English. The old German is hard to read, the penmanship is hard to read. But there was one letter I remember reading, I think it was there, of Emma to Feuermann, and I was like, oh my God, she's like really revealing her love.
Wow.
And so I think, yeah, she was
That's your great
my great-grandmother. I think she was in love with Feuermann. And it's, some of the language makes you think maybe something did go down between them. Who's to say?
Wow.
You know, I like to think so, just because I like drama. But I don't know. My grandmother,
It'll be
never
good for
asked
your
my
book.
grandmother. But my tante Katja, the pianist, Katja Andy, would tell me she grew up in Mönchengladbach, which was the next town over from Cologne. But she spent many nights sleeping over in the Reifenberg house in Cologne. And she told me, they all, so many servants, you know, and she was the one who told me that by whatever time they went to bed, then 11:30 or whatever the time was, the servants would get the people of the house prepared for bed. You know, it's kind of like Downton Abbey, I imagine. Like, I see that furniture and I'm like, oh, it's Oma's house, you know. And then everybody would go to bed and the candles would be blown out, but a half an hour later, Katya said it was like mice. You just hear all the people switching bedrooms, like. So I always loved that. So who knows who went where?
I see. Okay.
But I like to think.
Okay. Yes. Well, now we all can.
Yeah, you know, right? But Feuermann, he was definitely, I mean, I have all these pictures. I mean, he was a ladies' man, you know? I mean, I'm sure he was incredibly charming, it seems like, and full of charisma. And the ladies loved him. I had roommates, these 2 twins I was roommates with in the early 90s in New York City, and their grandmother had emigrated to Palestine and grew up in Israel. She knew who Feuermann was. And when she found out that they were living with Feuermann's granddaughter, she freaked out. And at 80 whatever years old, came to visit. I mean, she lived in New York then. And she was at our house for lunch or something. And she remembered everything about the concert when she heard Feuermann play in Palestine. And what he wore, she tried to meet him. I mean, she was like the girl with the Beatles. It was like the same thing, you know?
Wow.
So he surely had a charisma and some kind of magnetism that
Yes.
men
Well, he
and
certainly
women
had a
were drawn
musical
to.
magnetism, but maybe he also had a kind
I
of
feel like
sexual
he was a
charisma.
good hang, you know? I feel
Yeah.
like he really knew how to hang. You know?
I see.
That's something in the Hughes family we know how to do. So I feel like my mother chose well. Yeah, like so. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, he was. Yeah, they would just tell stories for days. I have family. One of my grandmother's cousins settled in Switzerland, in Lugano and Zurich, and for years, I would go with my grandmother Eva and my tante Katja to Lugano for the summer for a few weeks, and I'd take them, and it was me and all my tantes who were like in their 80s, just spending a few weeks every summer, and
Tante is aunt.
aunts, yeah, my great aunts. So I called them that. They were all sort of some version of
course,
cousins
yeah.
to each other, and they grew up, and most of them emigrated to the States, and Mariana Pentman, she stayed in Europe and ended up in Switzerland. But they would tell these stories, and I have them taped, some of them. It's so funny, like being in the car with Feuermann, and he just loved to drive fast, and they'd be cackling with laughter about these stories when he crashed the car, and then the car was like sitting on the edge of this mountain on a tree.
Oh wait, no, this I want to hear about. He actually had an automobile accident?
Something, yeah. I mean, the details are going to be very hazy, because they would always tell these stories like half in English, half in German, and laughing so hard, like little girls, and they'd be in their 80s. But there was some story where they were driving, maybe from Zurich to Lugano, and he was driving, and my tante Mariana was in the car. I think Katja was there. I don't know if my grandmother was there, but somehow there was some accident, and nothing bad happened, and the ladies were all horrified, but he thought the whole thing was just wonderful and very exciting, and they had to rescue them. Somebody in the car was hanging on the edge of a mountain, or who knows what's really true and what was like fantasy from memory.
Yeah.
But they used to tell that story quite often. And they made it, and somehow, I can see them all laughing so hard telling the story. 'Cause something about somebody arriving in Lugano to tell them what had happened, and Muñoz was there in his underwear and the blood, but he was laughing and he was fine, and he thought he didn't.
Muñoz was Emanuel Feuermann.
Muñoz
Yes.
was his nickname.
Yes.
So, but they would just laugh and laugh and laugh and talk about how funny he was. So.
He was there in his underwear? with
Somehow after
blood?
this accident, yeah, like he was standing on the. The details are going to escape me, and I don't know if I have that story. Maybe I have it, them telling it recorded somewhere. But so he was like, yeah, just like he was a real adventurer, I think, and liked to have a really good time.
That sense of risk is probably, you can hear it in his playing.
Exactly, that's true. Yeah.
It's nothing careful.
No.
It's,
exactly.
And his, if he recorded it yesterday with digital splicing, it would still be incredible. But when you think that all of this stuff really basically is unedited, they're
One
all
take.
live performances.
Yeah.
Perfection.
That doesn't
The
exist in recording today.
Top and bottom of the cello, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, there's not. I remember seeing the stems for my friend's string quartet. They're very successful. Of one of their records, I saw the Pro Tools file, and I was like, "Oh my God! I didn't know anybody edited that much." And I mean, I can be accused of some editing with my vocals because I'm not really a trained singer, and I get very self-conscious about recording my voice. But I just didn't know you could edit that much.
Now you can edit anything.
It's incredible.
Anything, yes. Today
But
you can edit anything.
For Feuermann to think that level of playing happened in one take.
Yeah. I mean, you can, and you can edit one note today.
Yeah. It's a strange thing, isn't it? I mean, I guess when we're listening to recordings today, we expect to hear perfection.
Yeah.
And then there's that same, I think, especially in classical music, an expectation that that's what you'll hear then on stage. But the human element is always going to be present. And that was something very interesting for me when I left classical music. I remember early on finding a really distinct difference between what it's like to walk off stage from a classical performance as it is to walk off from having played non-classical music, whatever it might be. And I have almost never heard a string quartet, a soloist, an orchestra members walk off a stage after playing Western classical music and say, "Yo, that was killing! That was amazing! I can't believe the way you flew up there and da-da-da-da-da." Never had that happen to me ever. With some of the highest playing level of playing you can imagine. It's always like, I'm really sorry. Oh my God, my C sharp. I'm so sorry.
Oh, yeah.
The
No,
exposition,
both happened.
I've not
Both
heard the
do
joy.
happen. Yeah.
But when I moved to classical music, I mean, I was so great. You can walk off stage and it's like, you killed that. That was great.
Yeah.
I mean, Henry Threadgill, do you know who he is?
No.
He's one of the most important great composers, jazz players from the ACM in Chicago. Long since a New Yorker. He's in his 70s now. He's a legend in jazz, or just music, really. Anyway, I was fortunate enough to work with him for a few weeks this last year, and he's been around for a long time. He's an incredible composer and mind. And he was telling stories, and he said something, how Monk walked off stage one night at Town Hall or somewhere and said to whomever was standing there, like, oh man, I made the wrong mistake.
I love that.
I thought that was brilliant, right? You didn't make the mistake that led you to something you liked. You might have made the mistake that led you to something, oops, I didn't like that.
Yeah.
So can be a little more forgiving. But yeah, so Feuermann, I think he was a real risk taker and an adventurer and a ladies' man and loved his daughter and I think they loved each other for sure.
Mm.
But I think they had a very different sensibilities about life, you know.
Mm.
And that was complicated. And they didn't have a very long marriage, unfortunately. So who's to say what might have been or was or wasn't, you know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the things I do know from my grandmother from days of sitting together talking about relationships and things like that and intimacies, that it was another era also. It wasn't an era where you necessarily sat and talked to your husband about how you feel or how this
yes.
makes me feel, you know.
Yeah,
Or
that's right.
how can we improve our intimate life, or these just not things that wasn't a part of the culture, you know.
But she came from this wealthy home where she probably didn't know how to boil an egg. So
Yeah.
when he would come home from tour,
I'm
was
sh-
she
they
sort
had,
of the...
oh, she didn't.
they had staff.
Not staff. I know that there was for sure, when they lived in Scarsdale when my mother was growing up, there was family. There was a maid of some kind, I'm sure. I mean, when I knew my grandmother, since I was born in the 70s, there was no maid, no staff, no nothing. I mean, it was like, you know, normal people by that time.
Yeah.
But when my mother was very young in Scarsdale, for sure, there was help.
Yeah. So she was 27 when he died. So
27 or 28, yeah.
right. So your mother must have been born when she was 23 years old?
Something like that, yeah.
Quite
I think she was
young.
married at 21.
I mean, these days that's really young. I mean,
Oh,
I guess
yeah.
back then marriages happened much younger. But
Yeah. My mother was considered old. She got married at 32. And so for her generation, she was
Yeah,
born in
that's right.
1938. She was quite
That's
already old.
definitely, yes.
You know, I was 10 years younger than all of her friends' kids, you know.
I see.
Younger, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know that approximately my generation because I was born in 41. So
Right,
yeah.
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 So and my
That's
dad
right.
was younger than her, actually, yeah.